Welcome, everyone, to the first European Humanitarian Forum. Bienvenue au premier Forum humanitaire européen. My name is Heba Ali, and I will be your moderator for this opening session. Je m'appelle Heba Ali et je serai votre modératrice pour ce lancement du forum. Ne vous inquiétez pas, je ne vais pas tout répéter en deux langues. La séance se découlera principalement en anglais. Alors, pour ceux qui sont en ligne, vous trouverez un bouton au bas de votre écran à droite pour choisir la langue dans laquelle vous voulez écouter. Et pour ceux dans la salle, il y a un casque dehors de la salle où vous pourriez accéder à l'interprétation, un pour l'anglais et deux pour français. The forum seeks to offer a European perspective on humanitarian challenges and to try to identify actions and solutions to address the unprecedented level of needs and the constraints that are being faced both by humanitarian operators and people in need. Obviously, everything that we'll be discussing in the coming days is augmented by the situation in Ukraine, which has brought to the fore many of the challenges that the humanitarian sector is facing. Over the next 2 days, you will be hearing from foreign ministers, government officials, heads of UN agencies, local and international civil society leaders, on everything from the impact of sanctions on humanitarian response to preventing gender-based violence in conflict, from famine to climate change. And you'll hear about how European countries can work more effectively and collectively. You'll hear the term Team Europe, I suspect, a lot in the next couple of days to address some of these challenges. I mentioned the case of Ukraine. It has, of course, brought renewed urgency to these discussions, and in particular, the respect of international humanitarian law, how to finance ever-growing humanitarian needs, and the role of the EU in humanitarian action. And dare I say, I think Ukraine has also highlighted the lack of consistency in the EU approach, and in particular with regard to taking in refugees. So we've got a lot to discuss, and it's great to be able to do so in person for the first time in a very long time. I will note that this forum is co-hosted by the European Commission's Directorate General for Civil Protection and Humanitarian Aid, ECHO, as well as by France, which is currently holding the presidency of the Council of the European Union. It is organized back-to-back with the EU Foreign Affairs Council meeting, and it will be hybrid, so you'll be seeing some speakers joining us shortly online. I'm the CEO of The New Humanitarian, which, as many of you will know, is an independent, non-profit humanitarian news organization that reports about crises around the world and analyzes the aid sector. So the questions that we will be tackling over the next 2 days are those that our reporters around the world cover day in and day out, and I encourage you to sign up to our daily and weekly newsletters to stay abreast of humanitarian news and analysis. Now, to kick things off, I'd like to invite to the stage the European Commissioner for Crisis Management, Janez Lenarčič, who will give us details about the key themes and objectives of the forum. Commissioner.
Good morning, Heba, panelists. I wish to welcome you all on behalf of the European Commission to this first ever European Humanitarian Forum, which is co-organized jointly with France in its capacity as presidency of the Council of the European Union. Minister Le Drian of the French Republic will join us later today. We would all have preferred to meet in a more peaceful time. While we are meeting here, Russia's war in Ukraine is causing a humanitarian catastrophe not seen in decades in Europe. Over 3 million people have already fled to the neighboring countries. Considerably more people are still in need of protection inside Ukraine, including children and traditionally vulnerable groups such as persons with disabilities. Many of them are internally displaced, away from their homes, and appalling violations of international humanitarian law by Russian army are observed every day. And Ukraine is by far not the only war or conflict we need to deal with. Humanitarian aid has always been an important priority for the European Union. For 30 years, the EU and its member states have offered help to struggling communities in every corner of the world. Together with our humanitarian partners, we have extended a helping hand to people with basic and urgent needs, providing relief in the most fragile settings across the globe. And we have consistently strived to protect the most vulnerable. Today, however, humanitarian aid faces unprecedented challenges. Humanitarian needs are now standing at an all-time high. Conflicts remain the key reason for humanitarian disasters. Climate shocks, population growth, and failed governance are closely following behind as the main cause or as an additional element aggravating humanitarian needs. While the needs grow, the gap between the needs and available resources to help widens. Therefore, we need to talk about the future of humanitarian aid. This is why we adopted the humanitarian aid communication last year, and this is why we decided to organize this forum. Allow me to offer some thoughts about the approach by the EU Commission to the key themes of this forum. First, how can we decrease the needs? As we have already reflected in our communication last year, one way of doing that is by tackling the root causes of the conflicts, the root causes of the humanitarian crisis. And this can only be done effectively if we work better together with our development and peace-building partners. Another major cause of humanitarian crisis, especially in the future, is climate change. And there are already some great initiatives to tackle the humanitarian fallout from climate change. Many humanitarian organizations are signing up to the Climate and Environment Charter recently initiated by the IFRC and ICRC. We are also investing in EU in new anticipatory approaches, which would bolster local resilience to climate change. Second, how can we improve our help and how can we increase the resources available? Well, improving our help, we should try to make our humanitarian aid even more efficient and effective through adjusting the logistics, through digitalizing humanitarian aid, through greening humanitarian aid, through localization, and in many other ways. In the Commission, we are also upgrading our own response by strengthening the European humanitarian response capacity. But we also have to look for ways to expand the donor base. It cannot remain that more than 90% of global humanitarian aid is funded by 20 donors only. Other donors need to step up, and we know that there is substantial scope for new and existing donors to increase their share of the global humanitarian response based on their gross national income. The funding alone, however, is not enough. We observe the humanitarian space under increasing threat. Every day, civilians, hospitals, schools, as well as humanitarian workers are under attack by belligerent actors. And we have seen this recently in Ethiopia, we have seen it in Myanmar, in Afghanistan, and Ukraine. And this list is certainly not exhaustive. We need to secure better environment for humanitarian action. That is why the EU is committed to championing respect for the international humanitarian law. Together with other world-leading donors, the European Commission is pushing for greater efforts when it comes to monitoring the international humanitarian law violations and fighting impunity of perpetrators. Ladies and gentlemen, today and tomorrow, this forum aspires to offer a European perspective on global humanitarian issues. It will be an opportunity for Europe and the wider international community to discuss different humanitarian challenges, to find solutions for widespread emergencies, and to propose action where it is needed most. It also serves as a clear opportunity to shape the future of humanitarian action, and I very much look forward to being with you here and wish you good, successful discussions. Thank you.
Jinlaro?
واجيلك.
Thank you, Commissioner, for your words, and that video gave you a little taste of EU humanitarian action on the ground. Now, you may be aware that in the lead-up to this forum, several consultations were held in different parts of the world to identify issues that organizations on the ground are struggling with in order to feed the discussions here. And so to shape the focus of the days ahead, we have invited representatives from the Middle East, Asia, Africa, and Latin America to share their takeaways from those consultations. And the goal is really to ensure that there isn't a disconnect between what matters to those who are doing the work on the ground and the discussions that are being held here in Brussels. We've also invited representatives, some of them here in the room, some of them online, of local, international, and UN aid agencies to join that conversation, react to some of the outcomes from the regional consultations, and also add their thoughts on the key issues that should be on your agenda in the next couple of days. These consultations focused on the 4 key themes of the forum that the Commissioner outlined. And the first of those themes is respect and compliance for international humanitarian law, which, as I think is quite obvious to all of us, is again under the spotlight with the Russian bombardment of civilian targets in Ukraine. So I'm going to first turn to Iman Ismail, who is the Middle East and North Africa regional representative of the NGO consortium ICFA, to share with us some of the takeaways from the consultations in the Middle East with a specific focus on IHL. Iman, over to you.
Thank you so much, Hiba. Good morning. Sabah al-khair. Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum assalam.
I'm so delighted to be with you all today, participating and share key messages and priorities came from the regional consultations. We don't have so much time, so I'll pick few key recommendations came from all regional consultations. Firstly, participants and all humanitarian agencies asked the EU and member states to increase their engagement and put more political and diplomatic pressure on national authorities in order to enhance access and increase protection for all humanitarian aid workers. Certain progresses have been done before, but it's not enough. And unfortunately, emergencies are increasing all over the world, not decreasing. And they were also suggesting certain involvement at the political side of the EU, high development and high-level advocacy level engagement, private and public advocacy efforts in order to enhance access, which is essential. Some of the key advocacy voices also confirmed from the humanitarian agencies that they still need huge support from the EU and member states to address different bureaucratic impediments regarding visa, work permit, and other daily issues that highly needed in order to reach to the people who are mostly impacted by the emergency. Another key advocacy message is, it was music to my ears to hear the word localization and to continue developing and fostering the principled and equitable partnership among all actors with additional support to be provided to the local actors. Local actors need support and funding, but not only that, they need a space in the advocacy working group at the in-country level, regional level, and they are asking the EU and member states to influence certain structural changes in the coordination system, in the advocacy working groups, so they can contribute with their valuable expertise, with their inputs, and work side by side with other international actors to address different access issues and different constraints related to the protection of humanitarian actors. Speaking also about equitable and principled partnership, what that really means in practice. It really means that all actors work together to discuss and manage risk, and also speaking about not transferring the risk to one partner over the other, but to share the risk in the spirit of having a meaningful and equitable partnership. So how we work collectively and not to shift the risk to those national and local actors, it also came loud and clear from the different regional consultations. And shifting the risk means that, again, we need to support local actors so we can collectively and equally share the risk. Local actors need the support, needs different coaching programs, and need the space. And by doing so, we can have equitable partnership that's built on respect and built on the fact that we need to mitigate different access risk issues and different, threats and different risks that jeopardizing the life of humanitarian aid workers. I'll conclude by saying that this is the first kick-off session in the first day for the EHF in its first year. And there were different voices from the field, from the regional consultations, asking the EU and member states to come up with concrete plan to follow up on the various recommendations and findings and priorities that came from the regional consultations. They truly believe that the EU can influence tremendous positive changes if a follow-up a plan can be in place to concretely get a tangible results. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Iman. So to build a little bit on what Iman has just shared in terms of access challenges, particularly in the Middle East, we're going to hear now from Mariam Touré, who is joining us online. Mariam is the advocacy lead for the Norwegian Refugee Council in Mali, and she's going to share some of her reflections on the main messages of the consultations held in Africa. Mariam, over to you.
Thank you, Ebba, and a warm morning to the audience from Mali. I have the honor to restitute today a summary of the outcome of the field consultations on IHL. In the framework of my remark, I will touch two important themes: humanitarian access and international humanitarian law. As we all know, humanitarian access is an inalienable right enshrined in international humanitarian law and mandatory to observe by all parties to the conflict. Yet, humanitarian access is challenged on a daily basis on the field. Among the many things that hamper humanitarian access are administrative restrictions. In many regions, such as Western and Central Africa, humanitarian organizations face challenges implementing activities because of the heavy administrative restrictions imposed by government. The field consultations echoed a need for donors to increase advocacy with national authorities to ensure work visas and permits for humanitarian workers are delivered, especially at times of political instability, driving sanctions against countries which also hamper their free movement. As a Malian citizen, I kind of know how sanctions can gradually affect the delivery of humanitarian services, as the country is now facing a battery of those which impact the movement of humanitarian workers, among other things. Under IHL, though, impartial humanitarian organizations are entitled to offer humanitarian services to all and any party to the conflict without such services being considered as interference with state national affairs. These principles are also enshrined in various UN resolutions. Yet, the field consultations are saying that more needs to be done to distinguish humanitarian aid from activities, for example, those of political or military nature, as in practice, this is not always the case. EU and its member states should further enhance EU compliance with IHL and humanitarian principles by introducing, for instance, standing and well-framed humanitarian exemptions in EU sanction regimes, as well as member state domestic and sanction regimes. In program countries, legal frameworks discouraging dialogue with armed non-state actors, for instance, especially counterterrorism regulations, constitute a major challenge for humanitarian actors with a deleterious impact on their ability to deliver aid to population under de facto UNSA, our non-state actors' control, and also to ensure the safety of their staff. We are saying that EU and its member states should ensure that their counterterrorism legislation do not prevent the engagement of humanitarian actors with armed non-state actors. Humanitarian actors need to be engaged on the presumption of innocence rather than having to prove that they're not guilty of financing terrorism when they're supplying humanitarian aid. Humanitarian aid is critical for all crises, and it is a weapon that allows to alleviate people's suffering. Yet, needs continue to grow while the space for humanitarian to work is shrinking because of access impediment, insecurity, but also a kind of disinterest or appearance of on the so-called forgotten crisis at international level. This has a direct impact on the negotiation power of humanitarian actors vis-à-vis government and armed non-state actors, among others, and therefore their ability to timely access to affected communities and deliver quality and immediate aid. To conclude, humanitarian crises need to be considered as such and have the same amount of attention as suffering knows no color, no geography, no gender, and no ethnicity. We hope that this forum will trigger a conversation, a change that will benefit the millions of people who need and are supported thanks to humanitarian aid. Back to you, Eba.
Thank you very much, Mariam. And I'm glad that you mentioned the issue of sanctions and exemptions. It's one that in our reporting we have seen time and again can have devastating effects, and not only in places like Nigeria, where we've seen a lot of that, but also Yemen, Afghanistan, and even in Europe, frankly, where the criminalization of people trying to help migrants has been astounding and rather shocking. So I know that you gathered us here today to try to develop a common European vision, and now we're telling you all these expectations of what the EU should do and what it's doing wrong, but I think that's part of the process, so congratulations for welcoming that kind of a debate. I wanted to just get reactions before we move on to some of the other consultations. And perhaps we could start with Shruti Patel, who is the co-founder of the Alliance for Empowering Partnership, which is a network of local and national organizations from the Global South. Shruti, I think often organizations from the South can feel a bit of a dissonance between countries in Europe and elsewhere that are pushing for greater access, greater respect for IHL, but then can be the ones, Mariam, as you said, imposing sanctions that limit or hamper humanitarian aid. How are you seeing it from your vantage point?
Thank you, Heba. So it's good to be here and hear some of the commitments that have been made by the European Union. I would say, just reflecting on some of the inputs now, it's great that there is real commitment to IHL, but what we see also is some behaviors which may look contradictory. So on one hand, the European parliaments and countries and states are providing huge amount of humanitarian aid, but on the other hand, you are also arming some of the states who are perpetrating violence. And in a way, that's kind of having contradictory effect. So if you want to really reduce needs, you also have to have the political will to work on some of those issues, because otherwise we will have no end to needs. It will increase the conflicts in different parts of the world. I think the other part is also, if we want to work holistically, it's not just about humanitarian, and you talked about peace and development as well. You need to look at longer-term perspective. So the humanitarian aid that you are providing is very short-term, and it has really bad consequences on the ground when it's so short-term. And the other thing is, local actors are there the whole time, before you arrive, and after. We don't recognize them enough and the work that they do. So I think the states, when you are actually implementing and you are supporting them, you need to make sure that they're also being recognized for the work they're doing, and provide more support directly. And if you are going to work with intermediary partners, which is great because there should be complementarity, but also ensure that those partners are really implementing equitable partnerships, because we see the practice on the ground is very exploitative. And I'm going to say that because I think that's where you have to provide your focus. How can you stop that exploitation? Because I can tell you the funding that is going on the ground is not enough for them to do a quality job and be able to have a sustainable implementation and working with the local populations. And that's a huge issue. And I know that the states are in the grand bargain. Some of the international organizations who you work with, Charter for Change agencies who are very committed to localization, but we see lack of real implementation on the ground. And local actors were very keen when they heard about the grand bargain and all the other commitments, but it's a bit disappointing for them not to see the progress that was promised. So I would say the states, you really need to make sure that your partners and you deliver, because otherwise the needs are just going to continue, and you will not be able to really show solidarity. For me, solidarity is really about making sure that you show longer-term commitment and a collective capacity at country level, not always having to fly in expensive, humanitarian response. Thanks.
So, Shmuti, you've naturally taken us on to the second theme that we wanted to talk about, which was humanitarian effectiveness and localization. And I'm going to turn to Juan Carlos in a minute. But I do want to pick up on your point about arming the parties to conflict. We, the New Humanitarian, recently organized a private convening where we invited, in fact, some of you in the room were there, to talk about the decolonization of aid. We invited policymakers as well as local civil society leaders and racial justice activists. And it was very interesting to see that while a lot of the donors in the room were focused on how can we better deliver aid, how can we get our resources to flow more equitably, the others were really focused on you need to be dealing with the geopolitics, you need to be changing the conflicts and drivers that lead to those needs in the first place. And there was a real dissonance, I think, in that regard. So I think that message is quite timely and relevant. But on localization, I'm now going to turn to Juan Carlos Viloria Doria, who is a Venezuelan medical doctor. He lives in Colombia and is the president of the Coalition for Venezuela, which is a federation that integrates more than 70 civil society organizations of the Venezuelan diaspora in 20 countries. And he'll tell us a little bit about the main message of the consultations in Latin and Central America, which will pick up on some of what Shmuti was saying around localization. Juan Carlos.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Panelist, Mr. Janez Lenarcic, thank you so much for having us in Brussels. For me, as Venezuelan, but also Colombian, thanks to my fathers, it's a pleasure to be here representing not only my people, but also the voice of many, millions of refugees and migrants around the world. We are the second largest crisis after Syria, and then we have those from Afghanistan, Sudan del Sur, and Myanmar. And recently, as the mention of Mr. Janez Lenarcic, the people from Ukraine. We are not only seeking for protection in the host countries, we are also to be part of the solution because we are professionals, we are athletes, we are artists. The Venezuelans, as all the other refugees and migrants around the world, we are trying to regularize our migratory situation. We are trying to integrate in the host communities, but also we are looking to be reunited with our families. In this space, in this Humanitarian European Forum, we hope to contribute to recommendations in the next 3 days about how can we engage the world from the civil society, the international cooperation, and also the donors country, but also the host country. We think that the best way to optimize the resources that we know that are not enough is to hear the voices from the local community, as mentioned Iman, as also Shmuti. We are working in Colombia, in Venezuela, but also in Peru, in Chile, in Canada, in many other countries around Latin America and the Caribbean, but also here in Europe, we have many Venezuelans trying to integrate their ideas, their initiative to the local proposal from the donors that are working strong, as we know, but we think that there is more to be done to hear the voices of the local people. The host community is facing a great impact to receiving us as refugees and migrants. We have seen many acts from xenophobia, but we are combating them, showing that we are part of the solution, that we not only look for benefits for our people, but also for them, because we have shown how to integrate us, made to grow our communities. As a medical doctor, we have seen how the professional can also improve the response of the host country. How can we contribute to the health system? We have seen this during the last 2 years in these pandemics. And now we are trying to send a message to all the people that Venezuelans and Syrians and Ukrainians, they are not different between them. We are the same people. We are all refugees and migrants, and we have the same human right than everybody. Today, in the International World Day against the discrimination, we hope that this panel and also this event can send a strong message to all the countries that are looking for the opportunities to strengthen the capacity building of the local communities. But also, we are planning to work together with you and to strengthen the democracies in our countries, because something in common that we have in all our crises is the lack of the democracy values in our society. For example, the climate change, the armed conflicts, and also the violence that we live every day. This has sent a very strong message to our communities that we have to face together, not only for one sector like the public sector or the private sector or the international cooperation. We are here to demonstrate that we can work together because we have the capacity, we know the communities, and also we can be in the same team working with you, as Iman mentioned, reacting to her speech about how can we part of advisory group, and this is a very strong recommendation that we made daily, because we think that when the stakeholder can hear us, can take into account our our recommendation, the projects that they implement and the resources that they donate to our community are effective to our needs. To send a three message very important in this space that as I mentioned, we are not part of the problem. We are the opportunity to demonstrate that we can grow together as community. We are also working very strong without resources, as mentioned Smriti, and we can do more if you can help us. We are not different between the crises that we have in the world. We need the same attention and we need the same quick response in all the corners of the world.
Can I ask you about that, Juan Carlos? When you saw the way the world, and particularly Europe, reacted to the crisis in Ukraine and Ukrainian refugees, how did that make you feel as a refugee in a very different context?
I think that this is a very interesting space to learn from the Ukrainian, to learn from the European countries, how they are receiving the refugees, as you mentioned. I feel very bad because I live that situation in Venezuela in the last 2 decades. We are not in a war, in a conventional war as other countries are, but we have seen how the democracy, the freedom in our country is decreasing and is getting worse every day, the situation. And many people have to fled our country. The only I can see is how the solidarity and the generosity that has shown by the European Union is sending a special message to all the world that we can work together to respond together. The way that the European Union is regularizing many Ukrainians is very important to apply for all the countries, because there is a big need to protect the people, not only to recognize that there is a crisis. We need to protect the people. It's a big responsibility. European Union is demonstrating very highly how it is important for them to attend this.
Juan Carlos is being diplomatic, but I will say that for many people in the world to see, and it was said plainly on the news that, oh, because these are refugees with blonde hair and blue eyes, you know, we of course we will welcome them with open arms, and that they are civilized people unlike those in Iraq and Afghanistan. And so I think for many other parts of the world, there's a double standard at play in the way that Ukraine is being dealt with that is quite frustrating, and hopefully a good wake-up call for the fact that, as you say, a refugee is a refugee. I'm now going to turn, you haven't seen him yet, but he's online, to Ramesh Radhasingham, the director of the Coordination Division of the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. Ramesh, are you there? Yes, you are. Hello.
I'm here, Heba. Can you see me?
Nice to see you. Ramesh is joining us from Moscow, if I'm not mistaken.
Indeed, I am, yes.
So that I imagine has colored your view of the discussions as well. So looking forward to hearing your thoughts. But I wanted to touch on one of the other themes of the conference that wasn't a major focus perhaps as the regional consultations, but is ever relevant now, which is the growing funding gap. The UN appeals for this year of $43 billion are 4.4% funded so far. And this is only going to be more of a problem, not only because Ukraine's crisis is adding to those needs, but because it will also make it more expensive to respond to the rest of the needs globally due to the rising costs of wheat and gas. So I'm curious, particularly as you're right in the middle of things, how you're thinking about the funding gap at the moment, and what message you would have to those in the room today.
Thanks very much, Heba, and indeed, good morning to everyone. And I'm sorry that I can't join you there personally, but you raised up, I think one of the biggest challenges we're facing today. One or two major have addressed the points on the whole issue of protection, and then the other one is indeed the funding gap. And I think if you were to take both these issues, we are dealing with the symptoms of it. So the funding gap is a symptom of the failure of human rights and development in the beginning, because you generally get conflict situations where you've had a massive failure of human rights or indeed development programming as well. And as a result, that leads to the conflict and it leads to displacement and humanitarian.
Ramesh, I'm just going to jump in because we can't see you. So I don't know if you've turned your camera off because the connection isn't great, but if you're able to turn it back on, we'd love to see your face. There you are.
Okay. You can see me now. Okay, great.
Yes.
Yeah, so very quickly. In both these issues, we need to address the root causes of this, because humanitarians end up trying to pick up the pieces of what is an ever-growing problem. And the growing problem is, in many cases, and we saw it especially during the COVID crisis as well, the failure of development to address basic services and the social services, social safety nets for the most vulnerable. And when those fail, you get crisis situations, you get all the early warning indicators flashing for conflict and political crisis, which then leads to increased humanitarian vulnerability. So I think addressing more innovatively development with local actors, and not the usual way we address development through purely just the capitals, but working with civil society and helping them to get the sort of capacity they need to address sustainable basic service programming. That will have a huge impact on and prevent indeed humanitarian vulnerability. So we need to address the funding gap through working with partners on the humanitarian development and political or peacemaking nexus to address these issues as soon as they arise, so that we don't end up picking up the pieces as humanitarians. We've seen it, as I mentioned, throughout the COVID crisis, where many middle-income countries who don't necessarily have humanitarian needs previously have had their social safety nets collapse and fragment because they've not been able to support themselves as a result of the economic impact of the COVID crisis. And they have now turned to humanitarian assistance. And it's easy to turn to humanitarian assistance because it's direct support, but it's not sustainable and it cannot be a solution. So we need to address that right at the beginning. And I think similarly, you have, for example, in Afghanistan, we're now facing a crisis where it's not really conflict. We have better access in Afghanistan than we've had for 40 years. We have capacity on the ground to support it. But what's actually preventing it is an innovative way to look at providing basic services through local mechanisms, through the local structures and infrastructure. And as a result, again, humanitarians are picking up the pieces. So I would say very much in short, to address both the protection and the funding gap issue, and to reduce and to roll back humanitarian vulnerability, you need to have a very innovative way to address development and basic services in the beginning, where you have that opportunity and not necessarily wait for peace to come in its entirety. We need to find innovative solutions at the beginning. And also in terms of the protection issues, how do we address those human rights, those massive human rights challenges that we face and that we haven't addressed, that then leads to conflict. And I think when we as humanitarians are only dealing with Band-Aid and the superficial needs just to keep people's heads above the water. But I think more and more actors are looking at humanitarian as the only solution to these problems. And so therefore we're left alone with a huge price tag, enough capacity, but the funding levels just haven't come to the same sort of levels that we need to address these crises. So humanitarian action is not the solution, and we need to go back to that mantra again. We need to have a much more innovative, effective development and a much stronger, more effective addressing human rights violations as well. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Ramesh. And I'll be moderating a session later today about the nexus. So we'll hopefully come back to some of those points around the need for innovative development work and not waiting for peace before you start doing that. But I think, you start to see how all these issues tie together, that the funding gap is linked to the lack of localization, is linked to the lack of work to prevent and resolve conflicts, and that the solution becomes relatively obvious, although difficult, of course. I think one example in which what you say plays out very obviously around the need for kind of a longer-term view on things is climate change, and where humanitarian action is not necessarily going to be the answer. That is the final theme of the conference. And so I would like to turn to Sumaya Kabir, who I think has now joined us online, for a little bit on that perspective of things. She coordinates the consortium for an ECHO-funded project called the Supporting Forecast-Based Action and Learning, SUFAL, in Bangladesh. And she will share with us some of the outcomes of the regional consultations in Asia. Sumaya, over to you.
Thanks, Heba. I hope you can hear me well.
If we could maybe increase the volume a little bit so that we can hear Sumaya better. Go ahead.
Is that better now?
Yes, thanks.
Fantastic. Hi, everyone. Good morning and good afternoon from where I am. Yes, I mean, it's great hearing all of these discussions from the speakers earlier about the need for dedicated or increasing financing to the different initiatives or humanitarian action. I want to draw on the disasters which are largely the reason because climate change is creating erratic weather patterns, and this is resulting in increased intensity, increased frequencies of floods, of storms, of droughts even. So what we need, I mean, there's a lot of great examples of how we are dealing with this, especially as highlighted by the European Commissioner on the need for investing in anticipatory action, investing in actions to prevent and reduce impacts of disasters which we can predict or anticipate. So that requires investments in early warning systems, which are linked to anticipatory action systems, which allow for information sharing across borders, which also allow for people to act faster, act better, or more effectively. We need to align our support to disaster risk management frameworks and also ensure that communities, their priorities and needs are meaningfully addressed throughout the whole process of assessments, of planning and implementation. Mainly, I want to also draw on the need for increasing financing for these systems to better act, to better prepare ahead of disasters. And one such, potential is to use climate finance to support disaster risk reduction and preparedness in the field. Particularly, what we need is a balance between adaptation and mitigation in terms of how financing is allocated, increase support to communities to adapt better to climate disasters, and also understand also the climate change impacts of on people, on their livelihoods, on their lives, and also displacement patterns as well. And also include climate finance, make it more accessible to communities which are affected by conflict and violence. Also include areas which are outside of government control. And overall, also think about greening humanitarian action in reducing the climate impacts humanitarian action also has. So I end there. These are just a roundup of the key points which are coming out from the discussions.
Thank you, Sumaya. And interesting, again, to see how all of these issues intersect when you talk about making climate finance available to communities, including those that are outside of government control. That links back to what Mariam was saying earlier about making space for humanitarians to engage with non-state armed groups and for that to be within the framework of acceptable humanitarian action. I want to turn to Dominic Crowley, who's been patiently sitting on the end of the stage here, and who is the president of Voice, who I'm sure, or which I'm sure you'll all know, is a consortium of European humanitarian NGOs, and has written a number of publications about climate change, among many other topics. But Dominic, your reactions to what you've heard so far and your expectations for the European policymakers in the room.
Thanks, Heber, and thanks, everyone. I've really enjoyed the conversation so far. But just to touch on this issue, I was struck thinking about this last night. I went to Al Johnson, the sort of early 20th century musician, and the phrase he used in one of his songs, "You ain't seen nothing yet." And I think the fear with climate change is we haven't seen the true impact of it. I think the exceptional extreme events of yesterday are going to become the normal events of tomorrow. And some would say that we're already there. So things are going to get worse and they're going to get more difficult, and the need for a greater response is only going to increase. Heber's asked me to talk about the word, our expectations. And to me, that's a really important word. It has at least a couple of meanings. The expectations that others have of us as humanitarian NGOs, and the expectations that we as humanitarian NGOs have of others, including, as you've suggested, Heber, some of the people in the room. So just to look at each of these two issues in turn, we absolutely need to look at our carbon footprint. We need to look at the impact that we're having on climate change. But we're not the problem, and we're certainly not the solution. And anyone who thinks that humanitarian organizations can provide an answer to climate change, they're the wrong expectations of us. What we're dealing with substantially is the consequences of climate change. We're tinkering around the margins with our DRR and resilience building work, but that's not going to solve anything. So if that's the expectations of anybody for us as humanitarian NGOs, I'd suggest you need to revise those expectations. In terms of the expectations we have of others, so we all have expectations of our peer organizations, but we have greater expectations for political ownership and leadership of the attempts to address climate change. And Voice, as Heber has said, has done a lot of work on this. And the paper that was put out relatively recently on looking at climate resilience has three key recommendations that I'm going to talk about very briefly and expand on, and add a fourth one too. I think the important thing, and I was talking to Heba beforehand, and she was saying, well, what's the big change? What's the big difference? There isn't one. We've got to do the basic things well. We've got to honour the commitments that we've made. There is no magic bullet for solving this. So if you look at the three recommendations that were in the Voice paper, the first one was to, and this has been touched on already by Samaya, to increase the efforts to scale up climate finance and to use that in a way that is going to be effective. The concern of NGOs is that we're being expected to do more and more in more difficult places with less funding. Not less in absolute terms, but less relative to the scale of needs. So how do we actually get supported to deliver on the changes that are needed? How do we actually put funding into or get funding for climate resilience, DRR, and disaster preparedness? The second area that needs to be focused on is to ensure that any climate measures include locally led adaptation actions, people-centered approaches that build on local capacity, and that prioritize vulnerable and marginalized people. But we need to ensure that the expectations of resilience building are realistic as well. No matter how much resilience we build, we're never going to remove the need for serious humanitarian responses. The pattern of food insecurity across East Africa at the moment, despite all the years of work that have been done in relation to building resilience of communities, is a case in point. The third issue around included in the paper was around the need for increased collaboration with different actors to enhance DRR actions and to promote climate resilience. This obviously strays into the territory of the nexus, not the triple nexus, but the old humanitarian development nexus. Climate change cannot be addressed, as I've said, by humanitarian action alone and cannot be addressed through a siloed mindset. We need to change the way we're thinking and change the way that we're working. It needs to be looked at every level in a sustained, coherent and committed way. Linked to that then, the paper calls for the need to ensure quality funding and flexibility between humanitarian and development budgets, that fungibility between budgets that we can target what's necessary. And to ensure, and I think this was said earlier on, the funding is released quickly and on a no regrets basis, so that we are trying to find, we're not trying to cure something, but we're trying to prevent something. I'd include a fourth issue, and it's probably related to that one. Climate is a threat multiplier. It deepens existing threats to all populations, but especially to the poor and the vulnerable. It creates more poverty, it creates more vulnerability, it creates new levels of risk, it's driving increased internal and external displacement, it's creating new conflicts and deepening existing ones, and it's increasing the number of people in need of humanitarian assistance, and so the budget that's required to respond to it. Efforts must be made to reduce or mitigate climate stresses and shocks, and they must be built into policies and plans of member states and of organizations in a clear and consistent way. Just maybe a comment of conclusion. In the build-up to the forum, the Voice released a statement, and one of the issues that we focused on in the statement was that of climate change. And we called for clear and measurable commitments to build climate resilience and adjust financial support and policies around the greening of humanitarian aid. There is huge and necessary pressure on humanitarian agencies to do more, to do it better, and to do it in more difficult to reach areas. But the political will and action is needed at every level to ensure and to address the causes of the climate crisis and the challenges arising from it. We need to ensure that new crises, such as that in Ukraine, do not distract the necessary political attention and funding from the growing hunger crisis in Africa, and we need to ensure that there is a renewed commitment to bilateral funding. The figure that Heba quoted a few minutes ago when talking to Ramesh, that the FTS is reporting that the HRO is 4.4% funded when we're a third of the way through the year is just not acceptable. Thank you.
Thanks, Dominic. And I want to pick up on the point about greening, because the New Humanitarian published an investigation last year on this. And as part of that, we found that one of the challenges was that donors weren't always ready to accept projects that might be more sustainable and environmentally friendly, and actually better value for money in the long term, but in the short term might cost more. So I think there's an action there for donors as well. But Ramesh, I wanted to come back to you in reaction to Dominic's point just now, that Ukraine should not distract from all the other crises in the world. What are you seeing in terms of OCHA's point of view on this, as to whether money is now being redirected from other crises towards Ukraine, and what would your warnings be on that front?
Thanks very much, Sheva, and also thanks, Dominic. I think obviously there's a huge risk that this could be the case, because the pledging conference for Ukraine went so very well as well. Our hope, obviously, is that there is additional funding that comes from other envelopes for the Ukraine crisis, and doesn't detract from other parts of the from other humanitarian crises. But I would also just like to go back to my original point, is that there's a lot of other financing channels available for the problems that we face, whether it's climate financing, whether it's development financing, etc. We have not yet found a way to coordinate amongst all these actors a programming prioritization whereby they can come in earlier, more innovatively, and address some of those issues that actually then lead to humanitarian crisis and humanitarian vulnerability if they're not addressed. And I think that's one of the things that we really need to address through the human development peace nexus. And it's been a struggle, I think, so far to try to find ways to do this and good models for this. But I think places like the Sahel, for example, which is struck hugely by the climate crisis, by conflict, by development failure, you have, basically have a laboratory for us to really start focusing on places like that where we can make a change. If we have a good model from that, we can then apply that elsewhere. But we do need the other parts to come in, and we do need to make hard decisions, just as humanitarians do. And those hard decisions means that they need to find new traditional ones. So they really need to work with the 2030 agenda is supposed to be with all of society, not just the governments. So civil society, they are the most resilient factor of our work, not just in the humanitarian sense, but also in the development sense and also in the peace sense. Thanks very much.
And I can't help but ask you, since you are in Moscow, presumably trying to discuss with officials there how to improve access, how that's going. Are you seeing any openings?
Okay, so yeah, so we're here trying to look at the deconfliction and how we can have more secure, safe access to those populations that have been affected by the conflict in the Ukraine. And we're trying to form a mechanism that's a little bit more strategic, as opposed to just looking to how do you get across checkpoints on a day-to-day basis. How can you have a more predictable, sustainable, strategic approach to humanitarian access in a situation, a kind of conflict situation such as Ukraine. So working with actors such as we do here in Moscow or in the Ukraine, is hopefully the first step forward to doing that, to have that face-to-face discussion. That being said, I think we in OCHA we're also reinvesting in our whole capacity and function on humanitarian access, working with the armed groups. And I think the one thing that has impacted us, apart from obviously the financing gap, is the fact that we have had little to less access to many of these populations. And increasingly we're seeing remote humanitarian operations, which obviously is much less accountable and much more difficult to monitor. And why is that? Because as you may have read in the recent ICRC report that non-state armed groups now control territories which encompass, I think, over 70 million people. And a large proportion of them are inaccessible for long periods. So our role now really is to how do we more strategically address the non-state actors to change their behavior. And this means speaking to them, having that dialogue, and helping them to better address, for example, the situation of women in IDP camps, or the situation of women and girls in displaced populations, how can they be better treated? And that's what we're trying to reinvest in. How do you have that access and strengthen that on a more sustainable, reliable way? Thanks very much.
I take it that you can't tell us more than about what's happening on the Russian negotiations, but I will leave it there. In the last few minutes that we have, I wanted to turn back to some of our regional representatives, and Sumaya and Mariam, I can't see you on screen, so if you do want to come in, just please jump in. But we've heard, if I can be frank, a lot of the common messages that we hear over and over in such conferences about needing to engage more with local actors, needing to direct climate finance towards fragile areas, needing to be much more conscious of the impacts of counterterrorism legislation and sanctions, needing to work more with development partners. Why, and of course needing political will to do a lot of this, kind of how far along are we in doing all of those things? And if not, why not? So that we can kind of push the conversation further beyond just we need to, you know, how do we actually get there? I don't know, Smriti, if you have any reactions.
I sure do. And thank you, everybody, for really very fruitful kind of discussion. But I think at the heart of it, if there are no consequences to breaking IHL or not delivering on the commitments, then there's no accountability. So I think one thing that I would say, we need to make sure that there is more sustained action in terms of what it is concretely we need to do in terms of, you know, delivering on localization by design, not default. And by that I mean you leave the country because there's no more funding, rather than by design saying right from now we need to invest in collective local capacity so they are able to respond to their own crisis. And when there is need, we will show solidarity. That's where we need to be. And I think one of the issues, I think, perhaps where we haven't made a lot of progress in terms of working across the nexus is discussion on neutrality, right? Because there are these boundaries. And this is, I think this is one of the reasons why the progress is not being made. The humanitarians are very much focused on neutrality, but actually, when you show solidarity, it's not very neutral, right? you need to show that you are, you know, especially when there are human rights and other issues which are being perpetrated, you need to show that solidarity. So I think we need to make sure that there are some concrete actions, but then there are consequences. If continually you don't deliver on your commitments, what are the consequences? Are the donors, for example, the states, you know, willing to make sure that they stop funding agencies that don't deliver on localization, right? Reward the ones who do. And I think this is what's been asked for. You need to make sure the behavior aspect, because we know that it's not just technical. If your behavior and attitude, and we talked about discrimination earlier, we know racism exists in the humanitarian sector. If we don't tackle those issues, you will not make progress, even if you have all the will in the world. So we need to do more work on those deeper aspects if we really want to deliver on issues of localization and so solidarity. Heba, earlier you said, you know, about the funding aspect. In Afghanistan, our members are saying, actually, we're already seeing the impact of Ukraine. I spoke to a member in Jordan. They already said they've been told that Ukraine is there, and so the funding is already shifting. So I urge the states here to really make sure that your response is not discriminatory towards the others who are also in need, because they are as much in need as your neighbors. And it's, you know, it's great to see solidarity, right? But please show solidarity equally to the other states who are also suffering. And, you know, your solidarity with populations in need is very much appreciated. So please think about that and invest more in local solutions rather than expensive international operations. Thank you.
We're going to have to leave it there. I think you've heard a range of policy issues as a little teaser to what you will be able to delve into in more detail in the coming days. You've heard a call, as always, I'm afraid, for stronger political will to end conflicts, to deal with the root causes of climate change. And you've heard a call to put the conflict in Ukraine in perspective and in context, that there are other refugee movements in the world, there are other needs in the world that shouldn't be neglected. So with that, I think we will close today's opening session. Thank you very much for your attention. We'll be moving now to a coffee break, and then the parallel sessions will start at 10:30. Thank you very much.
Sorry, coffee is served in the forum on the first floor, so please go through the glass door and you will find the coffee break over there. Thanks.